just give it 30 more seconds and we'll get going. Hello those who have joined us. My name is Sam Downs. I'm a fellow at the think tank Artha Global, and I'll be introducing the session today and doing the first presentation on city profiles governing climate change in Johannesburg, Mumbai, Karachi and Jakarta, with the other organisations you can see at the bottom of the screen, and they will talk about them, and I'll talk about who else is presenting as we jump into the introduction. So thanks for joining. Just a quick agenda first of all. So I'm going to set out in my introduction a little framework of why we're thinking about cities within these geographic contexts today, before diving into the Indian point of view. After that, Christina Kolbik-Fati, a senior researcher at Gauteng City Region Observatory, will take us through a case study from Gauteng City Region in South Africa, in which Johannesburg is part of, looking at off-grid energy investments there. Gauteng City Region Observatory is a South African research institute that is in a partnership with the Gauteng provincial government and other research institutions in the area. Then this will be followed by a presentation on urban climate governance in Jakarta by Galu Indrahasta, who is a senior researcher at the Cool Infrastructures team in Jakarta, as well as affiliated with the National Research and Innovation Agency of Indonesia. He's a geographer and planner by training. And then Adam Abdullah of Karachi Urban Lab will give us a view of heat governance in Karachi. He's an associate director there, focused on spatial mapping and data, and also teaches urban studies at the Institut of Business Administration in Karachi. And then his colleague Actus Fatima, an anthropologist by background, will take us through a moderated session reflecting on each other's presentations before a final audience Q&A. So yeah, before I jump into my presentation, we just wanted to talk a little bit more about comparisons of what we call southern countries or LMIC countries, and why we want to talk about them today. What you see on the right here is from a UN report earlier in this year looking at incoming climate risks and what countries in particular are going to be most affected. As you'll see, a lot of the geographies that we're focusing on today are in the kind of redder or darker orange categories. And particularly, they do face, of course, kind of your standard climate risks, but another issue is that they have high levels of human vulnerability. Now, human vulnerability in this context means things like informality, or kind of the chance for kind of quite significant migration. So kind of issues that exist now that will be exacerbated and become worse as a result of climate change. One of these that is also captured in the definition of human vulnerability is urban governance. And so again, across these geographies, typical characteristics such as low municipal capacity and significant urban sprawl of their urban centres is something we're likely to see. And so a focus on, can we bring down the human vulnerability in these regions is important, and given that cities, as we'll talk about today, can be a significant focal point in that, they're worth focusing on in their own right. But to look at this from a slightly international agenda as well, we thought COP27 was a good place to start, and again, it kind of suggests that this kind of focus is important. There was very little movement on mitigation negotiations this year, which some commentators suggest will make it a 2-degree scenario more likely. If so, it's particularly the geographies we're talking about today that will suffer. And while loss and damage, a mechanism to get money from those who have caused the most damage to the climate to those that will suffer the most is ongoing. movement is kind of at the beginning of a process, light on detail, and wider financing mechanisms beyond that are yet to be agreed. While there were some important discussion points today on, at COP27 on an urban agenda, it's still kind of in the symbolic stage also, and so maybe some time before it comes to light. Importantly, though, this focus on southern cities is something that is yet to become a focal point, and so, you know, definitely right now it's important for sessions like these and for countries themselves and cities to look at what domestic action they can take and share across peers what experiences they're having and how they're combating, you know, the challenges that urbanisation in these places is causing in context of climate change. So to this end, we've set out a framework where we've kind of pointed to 4 common characteristics we think exist across the cities and kind of urban regions that we're covering today. From left to right, we have data and community gaps. So in these urban environments, data has traditionally been poor, meaning it's kind of hard to grasp what particularly is going on across a range of indicators. Those indicators can be different in the context, and there are emerging bright spots, but generally this is a bit of a black hole. Related to this is gaps in engaging with local communities, particularly those based in informal settlements, where engagement between the municipalities and civil society organisations based in them can be ad hoc at best. Another related issue to informality is environmental and economic justice. Climate change promises to create winners and primarily losers, and in kind of nations such as the one we're considering today, economic inequality and the inequalities that exist, you know, from those who live in informal settlements to those that are better off are significant policy challenges that each geography will have to face. Related to both of these and kind of is low municipal capacity. So this is the ability not just for municipalities and city regions to be aware of the challenges that they're being faced, but to act on them also. And the mega trend we think sits behind all of this is, of course, rapid urbanisation. All of the geographies we're speaking about today have seen rapid urban growth over the last 30 years or so, and are projected to see much more in the future. Up till today, these cities have struggled to kind of maintain service provision while this mega trend is going on, and thinking about how that's going to evolve in the future will be very important. So that's that on the introduction. I'm going to dive now into my presentation, which was on the report I did at Artha Global, which is a think and a do tank based in London and Mumbai, with some of the colleagues mentioned on the right, looking at this issue, particularly in India. And I wanted to start by reflecting on the theme of rapid urbanisation from our framework, particularly by drawing your attention to the 2 maps on the right-hand side of the screen. What we have here is the city of Kozhikode in Kerala in 1975 and again in 2014. And what you'll notice is the explosion of red during these 2 periods of time. This represents the expanding urban area called built-up area, you know, which is a proxy for population growth, but shows kind of buildings and infrastructure over that period. What you might also notice is that the black line around the urban area has not changed, and the green lines that surround that black line haven't changed either. These represent the municipal local government and rural local governments around that. This is an issue in the Indian context because both have different standards, the responsibilities to their citizens. So, for example, road widths tend to be thinner on the outer edges of cities where rural local governments are, and sanitation provision is not up to the same standards. You have looser regulations, and what this causes is a series of issues for how urbanisation is unfolding in the city, as we kind of show on the left. So we know that commute times in cities like Mumbai are double those of other major cities in the world. Pollution in India is a huge problem, as kind of headlines show every year, really. Particularly for informal settlements, kind of heat zones are prevalent, and they face high flood risk, and kind of Dysfunctional urbanisation in general, not really taking into account climate change, is projected by one study, the Urban Transition Study, to cost the country $1.8 trillion a year by 2050 without change. And to put that into context, Modi, to tackle climate change at COP26, asked for only $1 trillion US. But in our study, what we wanted to do was link this kind of this picture really of urbanization outpacing kind of governance change in India with rising emissions. And as some of you in the audience, maybe climate and urban scholars, knowing that cities matter when it comes to kind of bringing down energy emissions, transport emissions, or industrial emissions, is probably no major surprise. May not be a surprise either that these cities do have a major role to play as well in kind of using the levers they have available to help bring down these emissions, whether it's planning for public transport, for example, or reaching out to industries within their regions. What we did find surprising, though, is when we looked at emissions per person compared to the national average, we found that something in India's cities in particular, particularly against middle and high income nations, we're doing something very, very different. So what we have here is that we know that emissions in cities like Calcutta, for example, are double the average of the average Indian, compared to somewhere like New York, where that's much lower. Now, when you think about cities and you think about emissions, the common story is that density means these emissions look lower, but given that India's cities are some of the most densely populated in the world, something very different is going on. And if we're worried about increasing urbanization, in the last slide it said that we expect 200 million more people to be in India's urban areas in the future. This is something that cities need to get a grip on. Going back to the theme of poor municipal capacity, we think this is one of the core reasons why India's cities are going in the direction that they're going. Skills gaps are quite large, particularly at the municipal level for officials. Vacancies can sit as high in municipalities as 33%. Primarily, this may be to do with financing and funding streams to cities being particularly low, with most of this dictated from state or the central government above them. When money does reach them, it's typically for very specific reasons that cities can't control. Low political engagement due to the fact that becoming a mayor in a city is not traditionally seen as a way to the top of the political pyramid, stops kind of your Mayor Bloombergs or City Cans from emerging. And this leaves municipalities in a situation where they are maintaining the kind of status quo rather than deciding and planning for the future, with these kind of higher levels of government and their bodies taking more of the action on the ground. Related to this is a kind of issue of data and community engagement. So while cities, while there are initiatives ongoing, for example, by the central government to improve data at the urban level, they are kind of set from the top, and typically, are seeing kind of slow levels of implementation. Public sector data, when it does emerge at municipal level, can be poorly archived, poorly formatted, and inconsistent in terms of taxonomies, meaning that the usage of it by other actors outside of the public sector is very difficult also. While there are bright spots in engagement with civil society, again, engagement can be arbitrary. So, for example, during COVID, civil society groups in Mumbai focused on health were engaged, but those focused on education did not, leading to a divide in outcomes in these policy areas for formal settlement. So what we do is we kind of suggest that kind of a route forward to change what's going on in India's cities needs to start at the top, given the political economy, a national net zero strategy that aligns all the way down through state strategies to provide kind of contextual plans to tackle climate change depending on the challenges that can be quite diverse, of course, across a geography as large as India's. This requires a reorientation of different levels of government to achieve this, but it's about clarifying and streamlining roles and responsibilities so that you have less actors at the state and union level doing very granular things on the ground, for example, and allowing cities to have more control, as they do sometimes in the West, over their city's future, like transport policy, for example. We believe this needs to come with a backbone of data infrastructure that kind of shows you important data sets at varying levels of geography, meaning that you can read through from a national priority all the way down to how that affects on the ground, infrastructure, projects, etc. Ultimately do transition through cities as demand for emission does. And so being able to see this, we think is very important, and will bring a shared understanding of the issues across levels of government and other sectors. It's worth saying a long-term emission strategy has now been released in India, and we're pleased to say that cities and urbanisation are a strong feature, but the kind of core challenges of municipal capacity and kind of who's running the show essentially at the local level remain. So I just wanted to finish my presentation today with a few reflections on kind of other, putting this back into the wider context of other cities, and saying that we obviously in our report are trying to focus on kind of the criticalities in the Indian situation, but there are extremely good examples in parts. It's a big country of, for example, good working relationships with civil society and informal sector that have improved, for example, how waste services are run, improving both health outcomes and environmental outcomes in Ahmedabad, and how think tanks have worked with municipal governments to improve citizen engagement, for example, and provide the skills that get in the way. On data, you'll see this kind of illustration on the right shows you this mega data platform we talk about is possible. In Bangladesh, they have a program called GeoDash that looks particularly at climate adaptation data, so that's pollution, heat, flood risk, etc., but provides at a national level that one can zoom down into. Similarly, South Africa's New Deal for cities and towns was at first a data-led initiative to really look at what urbanisation meant in the South African context, and was used to build a strategy out of it. So putting kind of cities at the heart of a wider strategy is possible, and we'd like to see that as the next step in the Indian context. And I've just put dealing with the backlog of issues. I'd like to provide an example because I'm sure everyone today will talk to you about excellent examples from across their regions of what they're doing to tackle climate change. And it's about looking across the piece to find the best solutions. I'll stop there and hand over to Christina. I'll stop sharing, Christina. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you so much, Sam, and very good morning / afternoon to everyone who's joining us. Thank you so much for taking the time. So I'm going to be presenting some research and insights from Gauteng in South Africa. It's the broader region around where Johannesburg is based. I am going to be specifically looking at some of the urban dynamics around Gauteng, and also how low carbon investments have an impact on social justice. All right, so firstly, I am from the Gauteng City Region Observatory, and Sam has very kindly introduced us. But just to give a little bit of an insight into us, we are a partnership between government and 2 universities in Gauteng, and we're set up to build the data and knowledge base to help support government policy and planning in Gauteng. And one of the things that we're particularly known for is a survey that we run every 2 years called our Quality of Life Survey. And what this does is gives a representative sample of residents who are living in Gauteng. And the idea is that this is a frequently updated data set that provides really good sense of what's happening in Gauteng to support evidence-based planning. So Gauteng is a central province in South Africa. It's actually the smallest province in the country by landmass, but it has the highest population, and it is our most urbanized province. It's also one of the it's also the fastest growing province in terms of population. And one of the reasons for this is because in addition to natural population growth, with people having children, we see quite a lot of migration, and specifically migration from other provinces in South Africa into Gauteng. Now, this graph shows you over time how people have been moving from other provinces and mainly into Gauteng. You can see the tall lines above GPs, the Gauteng province, coming from other places in South Africa. And one of the impacts of this fast population growth is the growth of the urban footprint. Now, this map generated by a number of my colleagues shows you how over time the region has grown. 1990 is shown in green here, the urban footprint, and you can see the yellow is what the urban footprint looked like in 2000, orange in 2010, and the red in 2020. You can see that to a large extent, with some exceptions, the growth has been very much in a sprawling manner, which has had quite a big impact on our ability to service these areas with infrastructure, and particularly to areas that were previously disadvantaged by the apartheid regime. So one of the things that we've seen is that so this graph is from the Quality of Life Survey, and it shows access to basic services and formal dwellings. And you can see that across the board in Gauteng, we do have relatively high access to services in terms of piped water, adequate sanitation, electricity for lighting, and refuse removal. But in the graph on the very left-hand side shows that, that we do still have quite a large proportion of people who are living informally, because only 84% of people have access to a formal dwelling. Then quickly focusing in on electricity, which is going to be the focus of the rest of my talk. What this graph shows is that over time, despite quite relatively rapid population growth within Gauteng, we're seeing the access to electricity and measured through electricity for lighting is staying relatively constant, which means that government's ability to keep a pace with population growth seems to be doing relatively well. But what they're not able to do is improve the access to electricity for the people who still don't have electricity to a large extent. So there are many people who do not have adequate access to basic services and electricity. Now, what's important also to take a look at is to see how this access is distributed across income groups. Now, this graph shows you that people in the lowest income category on the far left-hand side are less likely to have access to electricity than people in the highest income category, which maybe is not surprising for many people, given that many of the wealthier areas are more established and previously advantaged by the apartheid regime. What is important in terms of South Africa's electricity is many of the systems are relatively old. And because there's been such a strong push over the years to increase access to electricity, a huge amount of maintenance that's been required has not been undertaken. And so we're seeing quite a lot of electricity interruptions, as well as quite large-scale load shedding, which is a countrywide turning off electricity at various points of the day for different people to manage our load. And this graph shows how respondents of the Quality of Life Survey have reported weekly electricity interruptions. And what it shows is the distribution from a spatial perspective of how it is clustered in particular areas, and typically the areas that are worst affected by weekly interruptions are concentrated in areas that were previously disadvantaged. But Johannesburg, in the center of this map, is particularly badly affected compared to the rest of the province. Now, what's really important is also to take a look at this dynamic of weekly electricity interruptions across income groups. And this graph in the yellow, you can see that people in the lowest income category are more than double as likely to experience weekly electricity interruptions as those who are in the highest income category. And what this graph also shows in the green is that people who are able to invest in solar electricity it's also correlated by income. So people in the highest income category understandably have more the greater ability to invest in solar electricity and protect themselves against these type of municipal and large-scale electricity interruptions. So what this graph really shows, though, is that the people who are least affected by electricity interruptions are the best able to protect themselves against these interruptions, and thus perpetuating an existing inequality that we see across South Africa. So just a few reflections before I sign off on some of the implications that this has, but also some of the roles of data in helping us to govern these shifts. So firstly, how do we govern low carbon off-grid investments? It's really important. As I mentioned, South Africa is an incredibly large carbon emitter, and our electricity system is incredibly carbon intensive. We have some of the highest carbon emissions per capita in the world, and certainly some of the highest point source emissions of carbon. So it is really critical for us in particular to shift into low carbon emissions. But private investments, which we are seeing quite significantly, you can see that this image on the right-hand side shows a mall in Johannesburg with quite extensive solar investments there. What we're starting to see, though, is that these investments have an impact on redistributive justice, even though they're having positive impacts on low carbon emissions. So this is particularly important because South African municipalities use electricity and water revenues, particularly from the high income users and people who use a lot of electricity, in order to cross-subsidize and ensure that there is sufficient access for people who are poor, who are not necessarily able to pay for their own electricity. So the redistribution from the wealthy to the poor is a really important system within our municipal revenue systems to ensure access to basic services. Now, because the growth in the private investment space and renewable energy space is relatively new, our legislation to monitor and register small-scale embedded generation products is still quite limited, and our ability to then understand the impact that these private investments cumulatively are making on municipal revenue systems and our ability to cross-subsidize and ensure access to basic services is rather limited. So it is a really important thing in South Africa. We've been speaking quite a lot about a just energy transition, and that's specifically thinking about the large-scale shift from coal-generated electricity to renewable energy. And a lot of the focus on the just energy transition has been on the impact on the labor force and looking at that from a justice perspective. But what the dynamics that I've been showing you today are indicating is that we don't have a good enough sense of how small-scale private investments in renewable energy are going to have an impact on municipalities' ability to ensure a just energy transition at a systemic stage. So it is really important that we start thinking differently in Gauteng around monitoring and understanding these current dynamics so that we can avoid and govern the climate change transition to limit the negative justice implications. Thank you so much. Sam, should I hand over to the next one, or you'll facilitate that?
Yes, as Galu, if you don't mind sharing the screen.
Okay, thanks, James. Thanks, Christina. Okay, then. First of all, thank you so much for this very great opportunity. a very good morning, good noon, and also good afternoon, I believe. On behalf of the Jakarta team, I would like to deliver my presentation by focusing on the urban climate governance in Jakarta, particularly related to climate mitigation and also heat. First of all, I would like to start my presentation with the issue of urbanizations that occurring in Jakarta over the last 3 decades. So basically, Jakarta has witnessed a very rapid urbanization process since the late 1980s. The period when the Indonesia national government issued a set of deregulation policies, providing much more room for the private sector to participate in the development processes, including in spatial and also land development. So as a direct result, private real estate developers have started to massively change the physical contour of Jakarta. So during that period, as the country's economic heartbeat, Jakarta had also attract an increasing number of people coming from different parts of Indonesia to migrate to the capital city. So this kind of urban sprawling process has been inevitable, triggering Jakarta urbanization in Jakarta's peri-urban areas, or called as Jabodetabek. So today, Jakarta combined with its peri-urban areas, or we usually call as Jabodetabek, is Indonesia's largest metropolitan area in terms of population number and also economic prowess. So as you can see in the picture on the right side, this map presents Jabodetabek metropolitan area, and then the area inside the blue square is Jakarta. And you can see the expansion of the built area reflected by the red color. So this rapid and uncontrolled urbanization process has led Jakarta's decreasing environmental quality, therefore increasing the city's vulnerability to multiple disasters. First of all, located on the north coast of Java, Jakarta is increasingly more vulnerable to tidal flooding. Second, the increased rainfall due to climate change, coupled with the loss of so many natural landscapes in Jakarta and also in its peri-urban areas, has also made Jakarta more vulnerable to quote-unquote regional and also local flooding. The second notable direct consequence of these massive land use conversions in Jakarta has been the massive loss of green open spaces. So Jakarta has now less than 10% of its area covered by greeneries. And as many have also noticed, that the loss of this vegetation and also green spaces has led to the increase of average surface temperature, contributing to the urban heat island effect. So you can see on the map on the right side, it was recorded that in 2013, the surface temperature in Jakarta ranged from 30 to 34 degrees Celsius. But in 2018, the temperature on average is higher than 34 degrees Celsius. And it's also important to note that the urban heat tends to affect lower income citizens more badly, because they usually live in poorer socioeconomic quality environment, and they also work in the informal sector in a place without a roof to shelter. On the other hand, a consequence of the urban heat is an increase in the use of air conditioning, which, while cooling the insides of buildings, at the same time release waste heat to the atmosphere, thus contributing to the generation of greenhouse gas emissions. So let me now turn to this topic. Sorry, okay. So as many have also noticed, that urban areas and also cities are the largest contributor of these greenhouse gas emissions. The amount of emissions released in the atmosphere from human-related activities in Jakarta has increased from year to year, despite showing a decreasing trend from 2019 to 2020, clearly because of the COVID-19 related mobility restrictions. In terms of air pollution, Jakarta also ranks atop other Indonesian cities for having the worst air quality in the country. The transport sector in particular is the largest contributor of emissions. This is caused by the fact that so many people work in and to Jakarta, mostly use private vehicles, either motorbikes or private cars. So although the public transportation system in Jakarta has been very much improved, it is not the case in its surrounding areas, and also the system that connects the peri-urban areas to Jakarta. And also it's very important to note that given Jakarta's strategic position as an international and also national economic hub, The commercial logistics sector has also played a key part in contributing to these emissions. Related to the several efforts that have been carried to implement climate actions, notably in climate mitigation, also heat management, two things that become our concern today. And also with regard to the inclusivity and justice issues, there are actually some signs how these issues are actually have been positively elaborated in the context of Jakarta. One notable example would be probably the Climate Kampung program, which is initiated by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry of Indonesia in different parts of Indonesia, including in Jakarta. Jakarta has now about 240 Climate Kampung sites. So in short, Climate Kampung aims to activate climate participation, particularly at the neighborhood level. Despite its partly top-down nature, this program encourages citizens' participation for proposing and also executing relevant climate actions at their neighborhoods. In the context of Jakarta, Jakarta's environmental agency acts as an intermediary that utilize existing platforms such as Forum Masyarakat Peduli Lingkungan, also Rembuk Warga as channels for government staffs to interact with the communities in a very most informal and also relaxing manner. So it's create learning and also create a knowledge exchange in a very relaxed way. And another example about inclusivity in the context of climate action in Jakarta is how the establishment of neighborhood parks and also public space that is co-designed with communities. And the other probably notable example about inclusivity is that numerous measures have been made to encourage more citizens in Jakarta from different socioeconomic groups to use public transportation. Its inclusivity can be, for instance, reflected by the transportation fare, which is relatively affordable, as well as the integration of smaller vehicles, or we call as angkot, to the main bus system. However, we have also to provide the negative, view of this regarding this inclusivity and also justice. There are still some issues that might amplify the equal access of citizens to some infrastructures that can help managing the climate change effect, in particular related to heat. For instance, only about 1/3 of Jakarta citizens have access to the pipe water network. Water is regarded as an important means to cooling the human body. So for lower income citizens with limited access to pipe water and also groundwater, they have to buy water from water distributors or merchants at higher prices. Similar is also applied to the access to the green open spaces. And we also realized that actually data has become some very important thing to discuss. But in the context of Jakarta, there's several things that I would like to share with you. The first one is that in the context of Jakarta, there are actually several initiatives that we argue have helped better managing the storage, publication, and also utilization of data. For instance, Jakarta Satu Data or One Data Jakarta, Jakarta Open Data, and also the last one is Jakarta Smart City. Particularly in relation to the last initiative, some of the smart cities products have received international recognition, including the one related to a project so-called knowledge management for flood system. The system was first developed back in 2 years ago in 2020 when Jakarta was hit by a major flood. However, we also see that relevant data for comprehensively analyzing climate risks, vulnerability, and other things is still limited. That being said, there is a shortage of data and information in types and depth of scale on climate change. For instance, data for urban heat is still by large non-existent. And the last part of our presentation that we would like to share is the set of urban climate mitigation governance in Jakarta. So we believe that an effective governance is needed to enable and also to put cities as an integral part of solution in fighting climate change. However, it's also important and very interesting to note that the issue of climate change mitigation itself in Jakarta has just recently received attention by the Jakarta's provincial government. So previously, climate change in Jakarta was strongly connected to the issues of flooding. Moreover, although the although Jakarta's participation in the C40 cities network has been established since 2007, Jakarta is regarded as an inactive member until around 2015. And another issue that hindering and hampering the effective governance in Jakarta was governance fragmentation in addressing climate change. And most of the government agencies in Jakarta also did not recognize that their institutions are actually related to climate mitigation agenda. However, based on our understanding and based on our research, there seems to be a turning point in 2019 from a governance perspective. We argue that one of the underpinning factors is leadership. So the governor has taken a number of initiatives by changing the institutional arrangement in addressing climate change in Jakarta. First, the government's commitment can be, for instance, reflected by Jakarta's more active participation in the C40 cities network. For instance, Jakarta's governor is selected as deputy for C40 city network in 2020. And then Jakarta has also set higher emission reduction target compared to the national government. For instance, by 2050, Jakarta envisions itself as a carbon neutral city. To achieve those targets, Jakarta has already drafted so-called low carbon development plan document, claimed to be the first province and also the city in Indonesia to have done so. To address silos interventions and to improve coordination, Jakarta has also established a climate task force back in 2020. This climate task force consists of different actors from government agency, international development organization, and also research center from universities. This task force helped improving the awareness of many government agencies outside the environmental agency, of course, towards climate change agenda. However, this task force effectiveness remains to be seen because their work was halted in the beginning due to the provincial focus on handling COVID-19 back in 2020 and 2021. And besides aiming to improve the horizontal intra-governmental relation, the presence of this climate task force also aims to enable collaboration with other parties outside the public authorities. So various climate actions can be seen as urban laboratories where different actors can experiment. However, it's also important to note that the way and the extent to which these experiments can be scaled up, scaled out, and also or even continued greatly depend on the broader political context and the agenda brought by the next governors. So over the last 5 years, Jakarta's climate agenda has not received full acknowledgement from the opposition parties due to the severe political fragmentation that has been lingering the country since 2014. It has been also a commonplace that a program is discontinued after a new elected leader take office. So this also applies in Jakarta when for instance, when the bike lane program, which was initiated by the previous governor in 2020 as part of Jakarta's climate action, is discontinued in 2022 by the current acting governor of Jakarta. And then in terms of the vertical dimensions, the relation between the national government and Jakarta's government has not been always in harmony, particularly in terms of regulatory compatibility. What I mean is that, for instance, the national government tend to issue measures that are not context sensitive, appreciating the geographical differences between different cities and regions in Indonesia. So as a case in point, Jakarta's government see themselves to be unable to achieve the 30% green open space as instructed by the national government. Jakarta government then start to negotiate with the national government to redefine the concept of green open space and why this percentage does not fully reflect the diverse function that green open space ought to deliver. Other cases can be also seen when Jakarta's government has its own measure and criteria regarding green building that is perceived to be to better reflect the condition in Jakarta. Another important point that is that some aspects of climate change mitigation, notably in the energy sector, is under the authority of national government. Therefore, there is little room for Jakarta's government to intervene also to innovate. So, dear colleagues, I think it's about time for me to end my presentation here. Thank you so much. So I hand over again to Adam or Sam. Thank you.
Thanks, Galut. Adam.
Yes, August will just share the presentation. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adam Abdullah, and I will be talking about heat governance in Karachi. So in urban Karachi and in urban Pakistan, we as researchers work in a context of data opacity, where the collection or production and the dissemination or sharing of data on urban indicators and urban conditions remains quite inaccessible for various reasons. And the Karachi Urban Lab aims to fill some of these data gaps through primary fieldwork. So we're not associated with any municipality or government agency. We're an independent research institution. For a little bit of context, Karachi is Pakistan's largest city, located in the southern province of Sindh, along the Arabian Sea coast. And it has an officially declared population of 16 million, but unofficial estimates of around 25 million people. And we work to collect data on housing infrastructures, land tenure systems, and more recently on urban heat and microclimates. So within the conceptual framework that we are collectively working in across all of our 4 cities, Karachi, Jakarta, Johannesburg, and Mumbai, here's how I think we can situate Karachi and its climate and heat governance attributes in a conceptual matrix. Firstly, in the context of rapid urbanization and its associated impacts on the built form as well as on the social constitution of the city, we see a kind of intensity. So Karachi as an intense city, not just due to the spatial proximities and the density of populations, or due to the intensities of social relations or flows, but also due to a multiplicity of factors and the various temporalities of urban subjects and urban objects that often become hard to distinguish and disaggregate and to observe in discrete ways. This creates a kind of an intensity within Karachi. And a lot of this intensity and ambiguity results from regulatory frameworks where, for example, post-colonial tendencies of centralized governance systems are coupled with more recent or arbitrary cycles of state violence at various scales, from the very local to more provincial. And these competing agendas then determine how the city's space and its populations urbanize, and in what manner, in what direction, in what capacity. Additionally, the multiple tiers of federal, provincial, local, municipal governments also draw from pre-urban or pre-existing feudal, religious, and ethno-linguistic motivations, which get transplanted into new urban space as new migrants keep arriving into the city, and the city's spatial expansion keeps accelerating. So on a first level, these intensities provide a backdrop to the spatial politics and governance of climate change in the Karachi context. Next, issues of environmental and climatic justice are very, very closely tied to issues of economic justice and to issues of spatial justice, as we have observed in our fieldwork. In this, we posit Karachi as essentially an unequal city in various kinds of indicators. And this inequality is observed across material as well as intangible thresholds, and it manifests spatially, visually, and also cognitively in how the city is defined or talked about and planned for. So the issue of embedded inequality is one of the core drivers in understanding Karachi's environmental and economic justice issues. So just to illustrate, the map in the upper left-hand corner indicates the most common plot sizes across 50 plus informal settlements. And even though we might characterize them widely as informal settlements or kachi abadis in the local terminologies, just this one indicator, which is the plot size, is so dramatically different across these communities, from the smallest being 20 to the largest being 120 or even beyond, which in turn has critical implications for understanding, planning for, and regulating the urban environment and the thermal impacts of the urban environment in an equitable way. Similarly, the map on the lower right indicates the stark differences in the cost of drinking water per capita per month across these settlements. And you can see it ranges from as little as 4 to as much as 1250 rupees per person per month just for drinking water, which means that using water as a cooling strategy during hot seasons and during seasons of high urban heat is not for everybody as it appears, which I will discuss ahead as well. But this then brings us to the question, what role does urban data play in all of this? And where do we get the data for this? Which ties into our third theme of the day, the gaps in data, improvisation in the field methods, and engagement with local communities to gather alternative kinds of data in alternate ways. In Karachi and in Pakistan specifically, it is very difficult to get data from official public institutions such as the National Bureau of Statistics or the National Met Department. And then the politics of data and the logistics of the whole data acquisition process requires a whole dedicated seminar, which I will not go into in detail here. But in a nutshell, data is either simply not present, it has not been collected at all through a dedicated field exercise, or where it has been collected through national surveys, access to it might be denied, citing concerns of national security, or where available, where you can purchase or acquire that data. Upon closer inspection, it might be unreliable or not representative enough. For example, urban surveys that are carried out, for example, living standard surveys or household economic surveys in the province of Sindh usually have similar sample sizes, say 2,000 to 3,000 households for several urban centers in Sindh, whereas just the population of Karachi alone is more than half the population of the entire province, right? So that representability is not present in the data. Where it is available or reliable or representative enough, it might simply also be useless, such as freely available raster maps, which can only be used for pretty graphics, but not integrated as spatial data for analysis. Just again, two very small examples to illustrate this. At the top right, we see the only 2 state-owned weather stations in Karachi, the data from only one of which is available for public consumption, but it takes several months of running around to acquire, which we have been able to do over the last 2 years. But of course, this then also means that the state and its municipal wings simply cannot interpret urban microclimates just because there are only 2 data points. So they only talk about single point data series when discussing what to do about the rising temperatures in the city. And at the bottom, you see a raster image of Karachi's recently reconstituted 7 districts. But again, it's a raster image which cannot be zoomed in or refined for analysis or used by researchers such as ourselves for studying the city in greater resolution. And then, of course, there's the political handling of basic demographic data, such as the controversies over the 2017 census, and hence 2 conflicting figures for Karachi's actual population of 16 versus 25 million people. And ward level data is not publicly accessible. Their digital data files are virtually non-existent. For example, land records and revenue data. No maps of Karachi's informal settlements are publicly available. For independent research, we have to create our own maps and polygons and work on those, which leads us into the fourth theme, which is the low capacity of municipalities and local government to deal with core urban issues, specifically understanding the complexities of urban heat and how it interacts with other urban indicators to create very differentiated thermal experiences for urban populations. So in a scoping study, we found multiple gaps in the understanding of heat in the municipal imagination, as well as the whole disaster management dispositive operating in Karachi, such as the idea of heat impacts being restricted to heat waves as discrete events, whereas the idea of chronic heat, which is more pervasive and is often more elusive to study, was completely missing from the official discourse on urban heat management. These nuanced understandings have implications for the kind of heat mitigation prescriptions that municipalities and local agencies then consequently adopt and propagate, such as in the form of notices, circulars, and heat alerts. Again, 2 brief examples to illustrate this. On the left, you see one of the circulars by an administrative agency to warn people about a heat wave event, which advised them to avoid exposure to the open sun and to use plenty of drinks as preventive measures. And now these are broad prescriptions, right, based only on presumptions about people's lifestyles, economic routines, the affordability of drinking water, as we saw in their settlements. And the data behind these prescriptions might be anecdotal in a best case scenario, or worse yet, not exist at all. And these are just generic prescriptions. So these prescriptions then which constitute urban heat management governance, are based on suggestions or individual actions and not really evidence-based agenda setting, considering all the urban indicators. The allocation of budgets for heat management is a whole different story altogether. We're not going to go into it right now. But then we see that even these prescriptions sometimes do not reach those populations that might need them the most, right? So on the top right hand, the two little pie charts that you see, based on our own survey of almost 8,000 households and 2,000 outdoor workers, these are all informal workers, informal settlements and households, we found that almost 50% of households and 53% of outdoor workers had never received any kinds of heat wave alerts, warnings, precautionary messages, circulars in any form or media, on WhatsApp, in newspapers, on Facebook, through calls, through banners and billboards, ever in their lives, not just in a heat wave event, but not once. So these are populations that are very vulnerable to urban heat, but somehow the dispositive that operates and propagates messages on urban heat management and mitigation fails to make its way into these pockets of high urban thermally vulnerable populations. So these are kind of the 4 ways in which Karachi's urban heat management, as we provocatively claimed in our scoping study, is designed to fail, unless, of course, we can communicate across these gaps and learn from these gaps. So I will end right here and would be happy to provide more details in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much to all the panelists for such wonderful presentations and such rich presentations. We'll move on to the moderated Q&A session now. And in the meanwhile, everybody in the audience, please feel free to add your questions to the chat box and we'll get to them shortly. So my first question is sort of to all the panelists, but I do think that it would resonate a lot with Christina's presentation specifically. We know that in the global south, a lot of the narratives and the discourses around environmental management or climate change recently is very much so along the lines of economic growth versus environmental concern, right? And this happens both at the governmental level with different strata of government often fighting over, you know, what's more important at the local, provincial, national stage, and then also at the level of the local population in terms of their needs. What do they look for? What comfort is more important to them? So how do we understand climate justice and how do we situate discourses around climate justice in a context where economic growth is just as much of a concern as environmental protection?
Let me try and attempt that one. I think that's a really important important consideration, because I think the idea of climate justice can sometimes feel like a single thing, but I think increasingly it's clear that there are different elements of climate justice and different ways of thinking about it. When we looking at our context in South Africa that I was presenting, so at one scale, climate justice at looking at a broad shift to low carbon energy means a particular thing from an economic perspective. In particular, making sure that we don't make the lowest the poor and the low income groups, who are the engine behind a lot of the coal electricity, are the ones who then are worst affected by a shift towards green energy. But then, as I was saying in my presentation, when we're looking at a justice perspective in terms of individuals investing in renewable energy, there are different justice considerations, and and in particular, some of the things that we've been trying to think through and understand a little bit more is the individual versus the cumulative action. So there are definitely arguments that individual businesses are investing in solar electricity so that they can continue running and that they can continue providing jobs, etc. But the ability for us to shift into a systemic shift at a municipal scale, if private individuals and businesses are not feeding their finances back into the grid, it's going to be much harder for municipalities to be able to make that shift and also to be able to ensure access to electricity. So I suppose my answer to your question is, how do we understand climate justice? And I would say as many different perspectives as possible. We need to look at it from a distributional perspective. We need to look at it from participation. We need to look at it from a labor perspective, from an access to services. And it's not going to mean one thing across different places or within individual places itself.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. If any of the other panelists want to add on to that, please feel free.
I think I can contribute from the our observations from the Karachi case, in that even in the kind of discourses that we have had with representatives of municipalities as well as various non-governmental stakeholders that are working in the urban heat management scenario, we sometimes observe that each actor group or each stakeholder category can be focused on one line of action. So, for example, CSO programs in big corporations would talk about greening in a very different way, and greening as the only solution to this urban heat, increasing experience of urban heat in Karachi, whereas some philanthropic organizations might be more focused on the religiously inspired motivation to plant more trees and hence gain more good deeds, and which will keep multiplying even after your demise. And on the government level, we see agencies who are more of looking to jump on to ideas that are more current and more internationally acclaimed as leading to climate justice and thermal equity. So they would kind of support whatever donor kind of comes to them with an implementable idea of whether it's a small scale recycling initiative, whether it's like a beach cleaning activity sponsored by the commissioner's office. So I think it's really, like Christina mentioned, that we need to come at climate management or climate governance from a very multidisciplinary and multi-scalar kind of a way. Yes, individual action does have to play a role in it, but it's not just about convincing individuals to take action. It needs to be the scales of it, and the scales of responsibility and the distribution of that responsibility also needs to be accounted for in tackling climate justice.
Yeah, thank you, Artha, for that response. And before I get into my next question, just a reminder to the audience that please do put in your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them very shortly. And my next question is actually pretty well linked to what Adam was saying right now. And what I really wanted to ask was, in these contexts where urban policy is largely top-down and ignores a lot of the municipal needs, and we see various different actors that come more ground up or emerge more ground up, take on these roles or take on roles that fulfill needs of local populations or at the municipal level. What sort of actors do we see emerge? And I know, Sam, you mentioned in your presentation that a national policy or more top-down strategies are what are necessary to move towards action or climate safety that is very, very urgent now. But how can we learn from these actors or agents that emerge that are non-governmental, and how can we potentially place them in plans that support net zero goals within the global south?
That's a really good question, Actus. And I suppose, you know, what I didn't want to come across when I said that, and perhaps it was that, you know, a command and control approach to climate change is certainly the wrong way to go about these things. And in India, I think it's worth saying not just civil society, but the private sector has played a huge role in some of the kind of ground initiatives. So there was a you know, one of the first you know, successful approaches to kind of electric taxis, for example, was run from, you know, a local entrepreneur in an Indian city, for example, and some of the examples I mentioned around some of the work of pre-existing civil society organisations that have kind of, I suppose, brought together kind of what Adam was saying, funders' priorities with local priorities to kind of make action as important. And I think we've been, from Artha Global, kind of thinking about this a little bit more broadly about what kind of facilitative role can governments or international networks play to support these things. Just kind of on this topic of the private sector, one thing that kind of India is quite famous for example, is frugal innovation. And the idea with frugal innovation is you take a technology that might have been invented elsewhere and you essentially make it a lot cheaper, right? And in the same way, you have this in the civil society as well. And so we think the question is, you know, how do you facilitate the scaling of these ideas, right? As a government would be the kind of key thing, right? Where you do need a kind of top-down, you need a kind of national strategy, you need international strategies that will support this thing, but how do you aim them at the local level so that you can scale up these local initiatives? And I suppose so is my view on it, the question that we're wrestling with internally.
Great. Anybody else would want to add on to that? I could jump into the next question then. Okay. The next question that I wanted to ask is sort of a double-part question, and again, open to all the panelists. And what I want to ask is that when we bring together these four concerns of rapid urbanization and then environmental justice and, you know, gaps in data and municipality, how do we see data as a source that bridges the gaps between these concerns? And what sort of data do we need to help sort of fill up these lacunae so that we can move towards better environmental policy in terms of justice and capacity building? That's the more general question. And then the second thing that I want to ask Adam actually is, when we cannot look at official sources of data, such as governmental sources, and we move towards other secondary sources, how do we ensure that these sources are sensitive to the range of socio-spatial vulnerabilities that we are talking about, that engender how people experience climate disasters, how people experience climate threats? How do we ensure that the data we use and the data we generate is sensitive to these matters?
So does anyone want to go first, or I'll just skip to the second part? Okay. So as we have experienced in designing our own fieldwork and questionnaires in Karachi as we conduct our field exercises, there are multiple layers to the complexity of eliciting and, you know, simulating data from the field, because the base layers of data are, like I mentioned, unavailable or not credible enough. So one of the layers is the language itself, right? So when we started doing this large scale survey on urban heat and its impacts, one of the first barriers that we immediately hit was, how do we translate terms such as heat and thermal or experience into the local language of Urdu so that we can get adequate responses? And how then do we make use of those translations and reverse translate them back to English, and make use of that data? So there is this operating condition of language itself, that because the language of the municipality and the language of prescription is supposed to be English, and the language on the field is largely Urdu. So that's one layer of the data complexity. The other layer is the kind of innovative approach to capturing urban indicators. So what are the precedents in front of us? It takes time to kind of go through what has been done in terms of primary research in Karachi and to kind of build upon, but also point out the specific gaps that those studies might not have carried out. Of course, we also look at international precedents, but indicators such as the housing material itself, right? So when we say that it's an informal house, we have to internalize that the informal house is not a typology. The informal house is a very big and very disaggregated and a very gated kind of a community that is built through multiple layers and multiple processes of physical and social as well as temporal processes. And how do we capture all of that on a questionnaire form, let's say? So it's complex. It takes multiple iterations of pilot testing. It takes, internal testing, pay testing, you can say. Then again, sometimes we carry out entire surveys and see that, we left this one question which might have connected so well. And all of that experimentation happens when we know that, there is no broader data set to kind of gauge this against. So we kind of have to go around creating our own archives, our own first primary data sets against which we can then, conduct these longitudinal surveys. So that's the data part. I forgot what the first part was. So
I think that sort of covers that bit as well.
Okay.
Right? Just generally ask what sort of data we should be looking into to help bridge these gaps. Okay, I have one final question before we move on to the audience questions, and this is again a little broad in general, but what I found really interesting in all these presentations was that they're from very different geographical contexts, and there's this tendency to often homogenize the global south in terms of the kind of characteristics and the kinds of interventions that are necessary in improving things such as climate safety. But within these contexts, again, along the themes of urban expansion and environmental justice and municipality, there are definitely convergences. So how can cities such as these learn from each other in forming or improving the effectiveness of climate governance at the city level without or whilst being sensitive to the matter of not homogenizing discourses?
I suppose one of the things I'd just like to start with is, I think when we originally wrote our report, there was a lot of things we thought you should do as a result of it. But one of the things I've learned kind of listening to kind of Christina and Adam's and Galu's presentations is that there's a lot of things that we can learn from each other about what you shouldn't do as well, right? So, and this is not to kind of rule anything out or rule anything in, but, for example, the idea of decentralized grids is something that, from the literature that, our view of these things is that this is something that would help the lower end of the spectrum first and foremost, rather than go towards, help the kind of higher side of that. So looking at contexts where, as Christina said, kind of, inbuilt advantages have kind of compounded as a result of this policy maneuver are worth considering when, a city in, elsewhere, which has the same levels of economic justice is about to make that policy decision. Similarly, in trying not to take a command and control approach, which we're quite keen to do when we make recommendations in this context, and think about the role of civil society in embracing the informal sector. I think some of Adam's findings, and your findings, Actus, when working in kind of in Karachi, I don't think some of the detail of the report goes into an over-reliance on civil society is something that, again, one can naively walk into a lot of these, the thing is, they use this language of green growth, right? So another answer to your economic injustice question is, well, you bring together environmentalism, economic growth, and you find some magical answer. But actually, as well as, looking at best practices, looking at what's gone wrong, obviously not generalizing too much is as important, I think, when it comes to learning from one another. So using a kind of broad framework, I think, is what's important. Not trying to think that what worked in Gauteng would work in Mumbai, but saying, well, what, given these common characteristics, where are the likely barriers? What should we not do? as well as what you do.
Yeah, I suppose to chip in, and I suppose my input links a little bit to the previous question that you had. I think what is useful in terms of data, but also comparing across different areas, is not necessarily to like for the comparison in and of itself, or the data in and of itself. Like we can put nice comparisons together, we can create nice maps, we can create nice data. But the role that I think that these comparisons and the role of data is to open up debates, to help us to understand the different dynamics that are at play and how do we engage with those dynamics. And those are the type of conversations that we can have across different contexts, and saying, okay, well, how do we get different scales of actions, or different scales of people coming into conversation? How do we get the data to come across like these things? And I think that understanding how the different dynamics that are in different places across the world, and how they're engaged within those places, can be really helpful in to say, okay, well, actually, maybe we can start thinking in that type of way, or maybe we can apply some of this type of logic, even if the dynamics themselves are different.
Great, thank you so much. So I'll just get into the audience questions really quickly. We're short on time, so maybe we can go through them pretty quickly. So the first one comes from Mihai Mocanu, who has asked, we can see that efficient urbanization is based on a political dedication, energy, social justice, etc. Is there a way to define a recipe that would be able to provide a prioritization schema that can be applied as a general method to tweak locally? Personally, I believe that resolving the energy requirements can increase the quality of urbanization. Any comments on that?
I think this ties into something that Sam just mentioned earlier on, to what level of useful abstraction can we go when comparing across cities, especially when comparing across low middle income countries, and the kind of resource constraints as well as administrative and management constraints that we face, and the kind of these fantastical visions of development that our policymakers are enchanted by. So again, the idea of generalizability might be workable to on a very, like a national policy or something, but from the field, I believe the experience from the field teaches us, for the Karachi case at least, that each settlement within itself has certain kinds of, let's say, embedded practices or knowledges when they want to, when they're facing particular kinds of, let's say, load shedding hours, which differentiate by their districts. So they have kind of devised these heat mitigation or cooling strategies for themselves, and these are routines that are commonsensical and normalized into their everyday practice as well. So kind of looking at data that emanates from the field without you asking for it, without you designing your field exercise about it, might be a good place to start in terms of orienting us to the level of abstraction that we choose to aspire to, I think, and kind of engaging, and that's where the engaging with the local communities to overcome the gaps in data comes from, right? Because our data comes as researchers or policy advisors or consultants or people working in academia, but the researched, the people who we are working on definitely have insights that are linguistically might be different, or conceptually they might constitute a different domain of knowledge, but essentially would help orient us to a level of abstraction that might be useful. That's what I think.
Great. Okay, so the next question comes from Vivek Vidyanathan. I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing any of the names incorrectly. And they've asked, given that all cities in the global south face similar issues which were highlighted, are there coalitions across civil society which can be formed to address some of the critical questions? Or are there existing coalitions? If yes, what are some of the initiatives they focus on? And I think, Alu, you had mentioned that Jakarta is also part of the C40 network, and I know that so is Karachi. Anything that you would like to reply to in terms of that?
Yeah, actually, yeah, the presence and also the participation of Jakarta in numerous trans-cities network are actually very useful because they provide, how do you call that, cognitive leadership. So they have knowledge based on certain best practices that can be adopted. I mean, it's not fully adopted, but the way they present it as best practices and the way that they translate into local context is very useful actually for cities in the global south to learn from others who are more successful, not only from the cities from the global north, but also cities from the global south. That is the important thing that I would like to emphasize by participating in transnational cities network. And it has also been kind of, not our finding, but it's also been a kind of intuitive finding that most of the Indonesian cities, not only Jakarta, that have a very ambitious or also clear-cut climate agendas are actually cities that have participated in this kind of trans-cities network. So their role are quite not big, but quite important. But how to really amplify and then scale up the agenda into at the municipality level or provincial level, it depends on the administrative and also the leadership of the city itself. So in the case of Jakarta, as I mentioned before, that Jakarta actually one of the city from the global south that has participated in the C40 since about 15 years ago, but it was dormant for about 10 years or so. But it was actually the government who then reactivated their participation and then took the leadership to to also as a part to how to position your city at the top of the ranking, not only to to make your city more attractive, but also to show that global city also have the ability to support climate agenda. And then the second thing, I think, besides the trans-cities network, is also the role of civil society organization, also non-government organization, because in Jakarta, there was also a case, I think 2 years ago, when one of the non-government organizations sued the government, sued the provincial government, and also sued the president of Indonesia because of the quality of pollution in Jakarta and surrounding. But instead of just neglecting the quality of the air in Jakarta, the provincial government then issued a regulation how to deal and to address this kind of air pollution. So the way that the non-government organization can participate is not only by building coalitions, but also if we see the polycentric governance literature, we also can see that conflicts can actually generate interactive learning. So actors that actually do not build coalition with the government actually can also play a different role, but also a structural role to push the government to do better. I think those 2 points that I would like to emphasize in the case of Jakarta and also several cities in Indonesia.
Great. Would anybody else like to add anything to that regarding coalitions across civil society, which can help address the critical questions that we've asked?
I think from the Karachi case again, it's what we have observed is it's always good when civil societies or non-governmental or other kinds of stakeholders, philanthropic institutions, for example, they come together to kind of support and help the government implement certain policies where the resources or the manpower of the government agencies might not be sufficient. But this is like a double-edged sword, right? So it kind of in the longer run makes the municipalities and the administration dependent on outsourcing even the mundanities of let's say thermal mitigation to these secondary stakeholders, non-governmental stakeholders, and then the onus of responsibility is then somehow shifted from it being a municipal concern to it being something that the organizations are philanthropically engaged within, and people start looking up to the organizations as if it is a kind of a responsibility, or kind of a they start expecting that every time a heat wave comes, we will have, let's say, cooling centers or these water centers where these organizations will be operational. But then the responsibility of the municipalities kind of evades the eye of the public, who so there's this complication in engaging with or relying on entities other than the municipal governments or local disaster management authorities as well.
I think we have time for one final question, and then we can wrap this up. So the question is addressed to any of the speakers, and they've asked, is there any example of an intervention at the city or municipal level from your city that you saw, even a modest example, which has seen success and encouraged participation from local communities?
Maybe I can add something to that question, because I as already mentioned before, that the Climate Kampung program is actually what we perceive as probably one of the best examples that can be learned in the context of how the national government initiated program actually encourage participation from the neighborhood level. Although the design of the program is actually follow a kind of top-down nature, but it allows also rooms for the local government, in this case the Jakarta government, to to build a kind of network between them and also the communities that would like to engage in this kind of programs. So basically, I think the thing that also very important to notice in the case of Jakarta, although there are several cases that seems to be successful in the context of how they are successful, how they have been successfully planned and also executed several climate actions, but the basic things are still lacking. For instance, many of these communities, they do not realize that actually their climate actions are actually part of the climate agenda. So in the very local context, they do understand that these kind of actions are beneficial for them, but in the context of in the broader context, do not understand that actually their actions do relate with the broader Indonesian climate agendas. So that kind of discourse is also very interesting. What kind of success story that we can offer here? Success in terms of actions, or success in terms of that are improvement in the knowledge understanding of the community? Because I think what Agnes also mentioned at the beginning, that there is kind of tension between economic priority and also environmental protections. And in the case of, for instance, academic discussion is very, for us, it's very easy to understand that. But in the case of lower income citizens, they do not really understand what is actually climate change. What do climate change refers to? Something like that one. Thank you.
Great. I think that just gives us enough time to wrap up. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, all the panelists, for very wonderful presentations. Sam, Bandung, Christina, Adam, all of you. And I hope that these presentations are able to foster and generate more conversations here on. And thank you to all the audience members for joining in, and to Zara and Saurabh for all the behind the scenes work. And I wish a good afternoon, evening, morning to all of you.
Very much.
Thank you so much.